Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. On November 5th, 2024, the US citizens will elect their next president. The election in US has raised considerable excitement among Indian audience as well, and hence IGPP has begun an educational series to introduce the audience to the various facets of the electoral procedure in the US and reflect upon the various issues that are important to the American voters, which in turn would acquaint the audience with the social and cultural complexities of the nation. The program would further reflect upon the consequences of the voters' choice upon the larger world with particular focus on India, and highlight the role played by the Indian and other diaspora communities in the US elections. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine that began on October 7, 2023 has had significant repercussions on US politics, leading to shifts in public opinion, political debates, and student activism across the nation. The escalation in Gaza has deepened partisan divisions, influenced policy discussions, and sparked widespread protest. For instance, a majority of Republicans now support a stronger US alignment with Israel, while a substantial portion of Democrats advocate for a neutral stance or support Palestinian rights. This divide reflects broader ideological differences between the parties, with Republicans generally favoring military aid to Israel and Democrats more likely to oppose it or support humanitarian aid for Palestinians. Public opinion has also showed nuanced views on US involvement in the conflict. According to a Pew Research Center survey, a significant portion of Americans believe that US should play a minor role in diplomatically resolving the conflict, with a notable divide along religious and age lines. American Jews and Muslims both largely support US diplomatic efforts, though with different emphasis on the extent of involvement. These political dynamics have been mirrored on college campuses, where student protests have erupted in response to the conflict. Demonstrations have ranged from pro-Palestinian rallies demanding an end to US military aid to Israel, to pro-Israel gatherings emphasizing security and counter-terrorism. The intensity of these protests underscores the emotional and ideological stakes for many young Americans, reflecting broader societal debates about justice, security, and human rights. At Columbia University, over 100 students were arrested during the Gaza Solidarity encampment, highlighting not only the backlash against university policies perceived as supportive of Israeli actions, but also the intense brute force used against the student protesters by the university and state administration. These protests have also been marked as anti-Semitic incidents, with accusations that some element of the student movement have crossed the line from legitimate criticism of Israel to hostility against Jewish people, leading to further tension and concerns about the safety and inclusivity of the campus environments. These protests draw parallels to the Vietnam War era, where student activism played a crucial role in opposing US involvement. While there are remarkable differences similar to those historical protests, today's movements focus on ethical concerns and demand institutional divestment from controversial engagements. The demonstration reflects a broader critique of foreign policy and institutional complicity, mirroring the fervent activism of the 1960s. The Biden administration's response has been scrutinized from multiple angles. While some accuse President Biden of being too pro-Israel, others feel his stance is balanced or even too favorable towards the Palestinians. This criticism reflects deeper concerns about US foreign policy and its implication for domestic politics, especially as the 2024 presidential election approaches. In our ongoing series about the US presidential elections, today we are going to discuss how the Israel-Palestine conflict has had major repercussions in American politics. And to discuss the same, today we are joined by Professor Bhaskar Chakravorti. Professor Chakravorti is the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. A former partner at McKinsey, a faculty member at Harvard, he is also the founding executive director of Fletcher's Institute for Business in Global Context and founder and chair of Digital Planet, one of Fletcher's flagship research program that studies the impact of technology on lives and livelihood around the world. Professor Chakravorti is also a prolific writer and speaker on the subject of US politics, technological change, innovation, and sustainable development. His book, The Slow Pace of Fast Change, was published by Harvard Business School Press in 2003. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you for having me, Heena.
So before we talk about the students' protest in American University, I just wanted to request you to shed a little light on the US government's approach toward the Israel-Palestine issue over the years. And we have long seen the US as an ally of Israel, but have there also been dissenters in the American landscape who have argued that maybe the US should rethink its approach and policy towards Israel-Palestine?
Yeah, so the U.S. Political direction is largely in support of Israel, and in fact, the creation of Israel and the continuation of Israel, very much relies on U.S. help, both monetarily and defense and other kinds of assistance that the U.S. provides. In many ways, Israel is seen as its strongest ally in the region, and also a strategic ally in a region which is, quite volatile and in many places, during different phases. Is antagonistic towards the U.S. So I think from a political standpoint, Israel is a critical player in the region and a critical ally of the U.S. On top of that, there is an enormous amount of Israel support that comes from the fact that large Jewish foundations and Jewish supporters fund political campaigns in the U.S. So that's another reason why it is enormously important for American politicians to make sure that they express support for Israel, and for many of them, that expression also translates into substantive support for Israel. I think a third reason for the U.S. support for Israel kind of goes back into history. Which is that when the Jews were being prosecuted in Europe, America was late into the game, and there is a lingering concern that the United States should have intervened early, should have moved early. And the fact that it didn't is a shadow that hangs over American history. And it's another reason why the U.S. Feels that it needs to, make amends for its late entry into the war in Europe in the previous century. So there are many, many reasons. That said, the U.S. political establishment is not a monolith. There are many dissenting voices, and not everybody has this unconditional support for Israel. And across the political spectrum, you will find voices that have raised concerns about the extent of support and unquestioning support from the U.S. There are lots of questions about the state of Israel and its political establishment and its treatment of Palestinians in the various parts of that region where Palestinians live, in particular the West Bank and Gaza. And of course, many of these differences within the U.S. political establishment itself have been starkly highlighted by the latest crisis that came out of the heinous attack by Hamas on October 7th last year, and all the events that have followed since then. And that has deeply divided many parts of the U.S. political establishment, but also many parts of American society.
We had some experts on our show and also Biden supporters, and they said that the Biden policy in support of Israel following the crisis that unfolded in Gaza, and they argue that it has been one of the biggest failures of Biden, which has alienated the democratic base and the young citizens of the nation. Is that an assessment that you would agree with? And if so, why is there a disconnect?
So I don't know whether it is one of his biggest failures, but it is certainly a significant failure that Biden has been so completely in favor of in Israel, through this last crisis, and of course. The Biden team has been working behind the scenes to negotiate a ceasefire, to get the conditions in place in order for the killings that have been happening in Gaza currently to stop. But much of that has been happening behind the scenes. And if you sort of basically try and summarize Biden's overall position, it seems extremely one-sided in favor of Israel. And of course, the fact that many of the bombs that are being dropped on the civilians in Gaza are, supplied by the United States. That certainly does not help. And at times when Biden did hold up the supply of bombs, that seemed to send a very weak signal that he's trying to, take more of a neutral position. But that certainly did not satisfy the people who think that he's overly pro-Israel, and it also did not satisfy those who are Israel supporters and felt that Biden had betrayed them. So it is a failure for Biden to not have taken a more active stance towards getting the current crisis to subside. And it is also a failure for him to have been so overtly one-sided in this crisis.
We do feel and see that the US state and administration's approach to the two wars raging in the world, one in Russia Ukraine, another in Israel Palestine, has been sort of inconsistent and hypocritical. Whereas we see that leaders were quick to provide aid to Israel, in case of Ukraine, we have seen reluctance in with Republican leaders, especially in providing both military and financial aid to Ukraine. How do the citizens feel about it, and how's the youth's approach to the Israel-Palestine and Russia-Ukraine war? Like, is there a difference in how they see the two wars?
Yeah, so I think these are two, first of all, two horrendous crises that are happening in two different parts of the world. They have a history behind them. They didn't just come out of a vacuum. They also have a history as far as the United States is concerned. So it's just very, very complex. And so the comparison of one with the other is not straightforward. And I think it would be overly reductive to put them next to each other and then say, okay, why did we do this and why did we not do that? There will be very different approaches to these two conflicts, no matter which country you are. Because there's so much, both in terms of the parties involved and the histories involved. So I'm not quite sure how to address the issue. I think it is natural that there is going to be a difference. So, and I don't think it's hypocritical for the United States to have one approach to one crisis and a different one to a different crisis, because these are inherently very different crises, even though they're resulting in a horrendous loss of innocent lives, and there seems to be no predictable end in sight. In terms of the degree of support, both within the political establishment and among the ordinary citizens, of course, the United States being a large, complicated country, there is no such thing as the ordinary citizens' approach to any one of these conflicts. People have different attitudes towards Israel as they do towards Ukraine. For many people, they are not particularly well-informed or concerned about what's going on. The United States does tend to be a rather insular society. So for large parts of the American population, these are wars that are happening at a distance. And for others, it's deeply personal. For many people, they trace their origins to one part of the world or the other. So they are, very, very connected with what's going on and are emotionally connected to it. So I think there is, of course, a difference in terms of the connectivity that people feel with different parts of the world, depending on how closely tied they are to the news and also how closely tied they are in terms of their origins. I think the almost universal support for Israel, we have not seen in the same thing translating into universal support for Ukraine. Initially, there was almost across the political aisle by a bipartisan um, sentiment that the war in Ukraine was unjust and Vladimir Putin was an aggressor. But then it also meant the continued supply of resources, support, and armaments from the United States and from the NATO countries into Ukraine. And in a highly divided Congress, that has become a point of division between the Republicans and the Democrats. And the Republicans want to pull back support for Ukraine, and they do not see a political fallout of them doing that, largely because groups that are affiliated with Ukraine are not necessarily important political donors and political supporters. This is not the case for Israel. So both parties have a very strong sense of solidarity with the country of Israel. Both parties get political funding from Israel supporting foundations, families, and groups. So neither party would want to come out and say that let us step back from our support of Israel the same way that they have been at least somewhat one-sided in terms of Ukraine. So as I said, this is a very complicated issue. It's a lot of nuances here and hard to reduce it into a few sentences.
You have closely followed and written about the students' protest that against the war in Gaza. Tell us a little about the protest. Were they sort of like spurt of the moment agitations, or were they well coordinated and well organized? Many politicians are following the protest said that these protests were sort of anti-Semitic in nature. How justified do you think was that charge against the students protesting?
Yeah, so I think, given the scale of these protests, again, to label it as this or that, or, here is how it started, or whether it's anti-Semitic or, anti-Palestinian, it's overly reductive. There are, far too many of these agitations that have erupted over the course of the past several months. So it's very, very difficult to characterize it in a simple manner. From my understanding and what I've seen, a lot of these protests, did genuinely come out of a concern that many in the current younger generation felt was an unjust assault on, defenseless civilians in Gaza. And of course, there is a human reason for these protests to start. And for some students, they wanted to show solidarity. For others, they wanted to do something that would get the attention of decision makers in government so that they would do something. And for some others, they're simply there because their friends are there, or they're there because, they've seen it on social media and they'd like to be a part of it. And they're not entirely sure, what their opinions are, or entirely informed about what is going on. So it's a mix of all of the above. How these protests started, I would imagine that a large part of it did come out of a spontaneous reason for people to express their concern and anger over what's going on, and the inaction of decision makers, certainly here in the United States and elsewhere, to resolve the crisis. But then once you see that concern rise, there is a lot of organization that also comes behind it. And sometimes that organization is coming from a good place, and sometimes it's not. Once again, as you look across all the different campuses, there are different ways in which these protests emerged in different campuses. Of course, some of the protests had much greater significance in sparking protests elsewhere. Perhaps the most significant one was the protest in Columbia University in New York. And it certainly became a flashpoint, which also got exacerbated by the bringing in of New York police on Columbia campus. And of course, the fire that was kindled on the Columbia campus, then set off fires elsewhere across the country. And once you have fires in scores of campuses, that gets picked up and then brings other people onto the lawns and onto the streets. And you see that happening not just in the United States, but in different parts of the world as well.
When the protests were happening, those of us who were following it, many compared them to the anti-war movement that happened in 1960s and 1970s against the Vietnam War. But the students' protests have quickly dissipated. Why? Was it a fallout of the brute force that was, as you mentioned, used against the students, both by the state and also the disciplinarian action that was taken by the university administration?
Yeah, so I think the reason for this is complicated. There are certainly analogies to what happened back in 1968, and in particular, the Columbia protest I was talking about. There was a parallel back in 1968 where there were actually two different groups that protested at the same time in 1968 on the Columbia campus. There was one group that was protesting the war, or really they were protesting a weapons lab that was part of or being funded by Columbia. This was in the middle of the Vietnam War. And there was another group that was protesting a gym that was being set up in the Morningside neighborhood of New York that did not allow the Black residents of the Morningside neighborhood to use the gym. And so people were also protesting racial injustice. And these two groups sort of coalesced and became part of a common protest on the Columbia campus in 1968. Even though these groups weren't exactly close friends, they found a common cause in essentially sealing themselves in university buildings and going at it together. So a bit of a different story in terms of what happened in 1968. Just like in 1968, the police was brought in and the buildings were cleared as it happened a few months back. However, what happened this year was extraordinary in many ways. For one, for most of these students, what they were protesting did not necessarily involve their personal lives and safety in the following sense. Back in 1968, those who were protesting the war or those who were protesting racial injustice, for many of them, it was a deeply personal issue. Protesting a war during a time of the draft meant that as a student, my name could be next to be sent to a war. So I'm protesting a war because I also don't want to be sent to the battlefront. Similarly, for those who were protesting racial injustice, many of them felt that injustice in their day-to-day lives. What is different here, and I commend our students, regardless of whether I agree with their politics or not, I commend the fact that they did come out and protest an issue which most of them did not have a personal connection to. Yes, they may have had a personal connection in terms of some of them have families affected by what is going on in the Middle East. But for most of them, that was not the case. And they were essentially protesting a somewhat distant issue, as in the bombings that was being brought upon innocent civilians in Gaza. So I do think there's a difference in terms of the nature and the cause of the protests this time than back in 1968. A second thing that happened here is that the campuses had been cleared for graduation ceremonies and essentially the closing of the terms, closing of the semesters. And what tends to happen after that is the students go away, they go home, they go on internship, so they go elsewhere once the campus, shuts down for the academic year around April and late May. And so that natural clearing out of campuses also meant somewhat of a clearing out of the protest establishments. Not uniformly, we still have protests going on several campuses, and I'm sure some of that will return as the students return to campus. But then on top of all of that, there have been some extraordinary developments in the American political scene that has taken the attention away from the protests themselves and onto the presidential race. And of course, the presidential race has been a head spinner in terms of the developments that have been unfolding almost from weekend to weekend. And for many who were thinking of coming back and restarting the protests because the bombing of Gaza continues, hostages from Israel have not been returned. So the underlying cause of those protests are still here. However, the news headlines have been moving so fast in a very different space, which also is attention grabbing. And I think that sort of sucked the oxygen out of the protests, at least for now.
To talk about the upcoming presidential election. And to my next question, I know that there cannot be a single one-line answer to it, but I ask you because as a professor, I'm sure you have regular interactions with students, and there's a little bit of, knowing the feel or knowing what is going on in the minds of students, maybe a little bit. So how do the young citizens of US view the upcoming presidential election? A week back, I feel age was one of the running themes of the election, with many analysts saying that with candidates who are both above 75, it has pushed away the young people from the political landscape. Do you think the presidential race has been and the interest has been revitalized after Biden decided to skip out the race and a much younger Kamala Harris has taken his place?
Yeah, so the answer to your last question is yes. And sort of going back to the attitudes of young people towards the political race in the US, if you were to break the US up into roughly three parts, there are those who are decidedly on the right, regardless of whether they're moderate or extreme. Those who are decidedly on the left, again, moderates or extremes. And then those who are, kind of either neither, or they switch back and forth, or they're undecided, or they hate both. So these are the so-called, I wouldn't necessarily call them centrists, but you would call them the swing voters. So you say right, left, and swing, just to enormously simplify the electorate. Now, within each of these three buckets, there are younger people. And those young people in each of those buckets have a somewhat different set of issues that have made them feel connected or disconnected with the race. So those on the right, for many of them, Donald Trump was, some of them actually are quite attracted to his persona, and even the events of January 6th may have reaffirmed their kind of attraction to him. And for others, they feel repelled by him. So he's a polarizing figure, not just between the right and the left, but even within the right itself, because many young people don't necessarily connect with him. But then the assassination attempt on Donald Trump changed some of that, because Trump emerged from that looking extremely vigorous and in many ways very much like the leader that many young people admire. So I'm sure for many young people, they on the right, they saw that as a call to mobilize behind a late 70s man who appeared incredibly vigorous and energized and energetic after being almost within millimeters of death. But then Trump's Republican convention acceptance speech was a rather big deflation, because he could have used that moment to bring in even more of that youth vote. But then he lost a large part of his audience with a long, meandering, um, self-pitying speech. Simultaneously, he's brought in J.D. Vance, a very young vice president, and that may have also sort of caused another boost of interest among young people, though most young people don't quite know who J.D. Vance is, and it's quite likely that even J.D. Vance himself doesn't know who he is because he keeps shifting his shape, so regularly. So putting that aside, on the right, on the left, has been a state of crisis because regardless of whether people uh, agree with Joe Biden, think he's done a good job or not, almost everybody agrees that he is old. He's old, he looks frail. And of course, the debate that he was in with Donald Trump not only reaffirmed that, but put that, very starkly in front of everybody. So the youth on the left have been feeling rather disconnected and demoralized and deflated by the option that they had on the Democratic ticket. And then you have the swing voters who, some of them don't like either Trump or Biden. Many of them just felt disconnected in the middle, and for many of them, they feel that their lives have not been improved. Either under either administration, so they had been switched off. Now, just like the deplorable assassination attempt on Trump changed the game, brought in a different dose of energy into the campaign from the Trump side. The inevitable dropping of the shoe of Biden, as in him stepping out of the race, which was almost something that everyone was anticipating, but it was dragged on for so long that when it happened, it came as a surprise and it came as a release. And before 24 hours were out, you could see the absolute cascade of energy that had been injected by the endorsement of Kamala Harris and the fact that she presented a fresh face, a youthful face. She's 59. She's not exactly a spring chicken, but compared to the alternatives, she is very young, and she does have a much more youthful persona. And there are viral videos of her, appearing quite youthful, and of course, many more viral videos of her laughing, which was a liability in the past, and now it might have actually become an asset, as you have memes of that traveling around, from her supporters. So suddenly you see a revitalization of interest on the left, and it's interesting that somebody like Kamala Harris, who actually was not a particularly popular politician, for many people, she is still an enigma. Most people don't quite know who she is. I mean, they know who she is, but they don't quite know who she really is and what she stands for. And to some extent, even people who were Democrats actually didn't quite care for her. And it's unclear as to why they didn't care for her. And one can break it down because you can say that, well, she wasn't really clear as to what her message was when she ran for president in 2020. So there are many reasons why Kamala Harris had a rather sort of a lukewarm connection with the youth prior to last weekend. But then once she entered the presidential race and was endorsed by Biden, within 24 hours, she had gone from being an unpopular politician with lukewarm support to somebody who's an absolute star. She's become not just an internet sensation, she's become a sensation on practically every platform you can think of. And you can see a jolt of energy. And in some ways, the fact that Biden took so much time and delayed his announcement, caused this massive release of energy, which paradoxically actually has helped Kamala Harris. And so within 24 hours, she had sealed up the nomination. There are lots of very, very strong contenders to step into Biden's shoes, but we are now in a situation where there is nobody who can even touch Kamala Harris going into the Democratic convention. And now, of course, with this energy, the youth are the youth on the left feel re-energized. I'm sure there are some on the right who are looking at her and kind of saying, well, they didn't like Trump the last time around, and maybe, they might switch their labels, maybe not a large number, but certainly some might. And then all of American presidential races come down to the swing states. Ultimately, those swing states are the ones that determine the race. And here we're talking about a candidate who's not just young, as I said, 59 years old, young by political standards. She's a woman. She's a woman of color. She's a woman of color with multiple ethnic identities within her. And instantly, that sort of brings in a whole lot of interest, not just from the young, but from women across the board. So one of her defining political platforms is going to be to keep abortion legal. And this is going to resonate across the board. Keeping abortion legal across genders, across races, across party affiliation. Certainly, when you look at people in the center of the Republican Party and people across the entire democratic spectrum want to keep abortion legal in this country. So you will see a return to a huge amount of enthusiasm for a candidate who's pushing that. A lot of young people are also keen on seeing not just a woman in the White House, but also a return to a person of color in the White House. So Kamala Harris sort of embodies both. She has been extremely astute in terms of her political activity ever since the announcement from Biden on Sunday, and she's taken some extraordinarily smart moves to seal up her candidacy. She's done several things that already show that she has studied some of the mistakes that Hillary Clinton had made in her campaign. And I'll give you two. One was one of the issues that Hillary struggled with was that there was an automatic presumption that she was going to be coronated, not just the next nominee from the Democratic side, but also the next president of the United States. There was almost an inevitability to her candidacy, which made her team complacent, but it also repelled a lot of people. And particularly young people who don't kind of like being told what the end of the story is or what to do. So I think Hillary suffered from that in the polls, and Kamala Harris was very smart. As soon as Biden endorsed her, she did not automatically assume that the nomination was hers for the taking. She said, "I intend to earn and win the nomination." Very, very smart, because that shows a degree of humility and shows an acceptance that we do live in a democracy, and there needs to be a grassroots support for this candidate. This candidate should not just be anointed by the current king. So that was one smart move. Another smart move was one of her first stops right out of the gate after she became an official candidate for president, was to go to this very important swing state of Wisconsin. And Hillary Clinton actually skipped Wisconsin during her campaign. And that was her downfall. She missed so much of what was happening in Middle America. And the fact that Kamala Harris went there sent a very strong signal that she is paying attention to that part of the country. And ultimately, that middle of the country is what determines presidential elections.
Thank you so much for joining us today and giving this very enlightening and very insightful talk.